Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
So, as some of our listeners may know, and all the new listeners that are coming in for the first time, the Grid Modernization podcast, or the Grid Mod Pod, was really created to have a platform to engage and really educate and hopefully empower our industry to really embrace what is grid mod and how the very large, complex grid that we all know and love, because it's the lifeline of society, is transforming, faster than we know. And some may even said it already transformed, and now we're catching up to that reality. And so, I am excited to talk about the edge, because that's where my heart sits. But there is a much bigger grid to it. But today, I'm happy to have Astrid Atkinson, the CEO and founder of Camus, which I'll let you explain a little bit about that company. But it's really all about enabling and unlocking the phenomena, or the verbiage, grid orchestration, which falls in line with, virtual power plants and enabling distributed resources. But getting real specific to how that can be unlocked is what we're going to talk about today. So please take the time to give us your background, Astrid.
Awesome. Yeah. So firstly, I'm the CEO and co-founder for Camus, as you mentioned. We describe what we do as software for grid orchestration. So we work primarily with distribution utilities. And by grid orchestration, what we really mean is being able to understand the needs of the grid and then connect those to dispatch of distributed and local resources to provide system level management within the distribution grid environment. So we really kind of think of our job as being able to help provide the fabric for distribution utilities to take on a distribution system operator role. And the orchestration piece is really about getting all of those resources of, disparate types and needs and sizes and locations and everything to work together as part of kind of one big picture, or one big orchestra, if you will, to get more out of the grid that we have, save money on the grid we're going to build, provide reliable service, and provide mechanisms for customers and kind of customer producers to engage in providing services to the grid and supporting the fabric of the grid. So that's kind of what we do as a company. My background prior to co-founding this company was on the tech side. I was at Google from about 2004 until I left in 2019 to found this company, and was really fortunate to be part of the team there that was pioneering the cloud computing model when it was new in the industry. My area of specialty was really focused around system reliability and reliable operations at scale. So I ran ops teams for a number of years and did a lot of work inside Google on helping to establish infrastructure and processes and procedures and operations models and all of these things for building highly reliable services in this entirely new kind of computing model. So one of the things that we were trying to accomplish when we started this company was to bring not necessarily those specific technologies, because the specific technologies need to be different, but rather to bring some of that perspective and some of that experience and kind of pioneering reliability in a really fundamentally new kind of operating environment, and lend some of what we learned to the work that is ahead of us in the grid. So that's me and my background, and maybe a little bit of what we're doing here.
And I think, just to kind of level set, we talk about this a lot, but the grid as itself, it was been built and really focused on the hardware. And so I like to think about it, we have become very efficient and effective and understand how the muscles of the power grid can really work from a mechanical and really a physicality perspective.
Yep.
And so when you think about, computer services or origination of, everything that you kind of learned in your experience from 2004 to 2019, what really rolled out was the opportunity to kind of capitalize on all of the changes that are occurring in the power grid. And so you're the software base. So kind of, I like to think that the power grid has the muscles, and the original neural network was your telephone system.
That's
and
right.
then in the 70s and 80s, we really gravitated and started to utilize, fiber and other origination of communication that really delved into Wi-Fi. And then all of that network had to come to the brain. So really those that are controlling and managing the flow of electrons from the substation of where the energy is being received and down into the distribution grid. And so I think a lot of us talk about this reality that is coming to be, and if not here in some spaces, and that's what I look forward to hearing how, those challenges you kind of been able to work through, is that visibility and the orchestration thereof was not something that was really required to perform the 24/7, 365 safe, reliable, affordable power. But now, because of the changes of our customers being more dynamic in how they use their energy, and that really, from our perspective, you and I, the influx of the data that has now become available, and all of the services and systems that you have experience developing, you started probably seeing like a moment, like, how do we talk to these devices? So for you, watching that influx of devices, and so I like to also counter this point is the word smart grid and smart meter. I think a lot of those listening lose sight of all that means is you're able to communicate to it, right? At first it was one way, and now what you're seeing and kind of rolling out is that two-way communication and taking action.
Yeah.
And so not only the smart grid devices, but Internet of Things. So all of the things us customers want to do now have a play, and that's really the space you're in. So how have you, and what were you observing, and the influx really kind of started putting the pieces together, and how have you kind of moved into the utility space with that?
Yeah, so I think firstly, the parallel with some of the work that we did in the internet space is exactly in those kinds of changes that you just described, right? Like the grid, the internet relies on a physical network that has physical constraints, and it has, kind of muscles and bones of its own. It has the physical fiber lines, it has backbones, it has distribution that connects to individual kind of homes and businesses. And for a long time, that was something that, like the grid up until recently, was not particularly dynamic or particularly well instrumented or managed. So one of the big things that happened when we kind of got into the age of cloud computing and the age of Google was that we were suddenly starting to ask that network to do just a hell of a lot more work, right? It was previously, used for phone calls. It was used for maybe, pushing numbers backwards and forwards, like a website, a flight, looking up a page about ferrets for your kid's school. But it wasn't used for the sort of 1,000 times more data that is needed to support things like video. Live streaming of the ferret from your kid's school is a very different demand on the network than, that previous model. And so one of the things that really changed in the computing industry was getting really smart and really sophisticated about, firstly, monitoring what was happening on that network. So actually having that, like the smart grid equivalent of like live telemetry from all of the points. And then building a software control plane that was able to make really smart switching prioritization decisions, not necessarily even about individual, transactions, but really more about how do you manage the pipes? Like, how do you decide who gets to use this big backbone pipe? And if there's contention for resources, do you have mechanisms to like drop some traffic and take some other traffic? We don't really have that on the grid today, but that's kind of the world that we're moving towards as we think about, kind of dividing up like the base load versus perhaps load flexibility, the transitioning from a model of demand response where it's like, okay, you could call them to get them to turn down the chillers next Tuesday, to one in which perhaps you have live instrumentation of different types of demand, and some of those could be flexed through software if you needed them to be. So when we talk about parallels between like kind of the computing infrastructure and the grid, it's really that idea of, bringing in that real-time telemetry or real-time monitoring, and then being able to also start to move some of the ways that we do work on the grid to a more real-time and automated kind of situation. So that's obviously in its infancy, But I think that's really the goal of the smart grid, is to be able to have that data, be able to make smart decisions about it, and then be able to do something with that information in something like real time.
I just, for some reason, just thinking about time span, I just watched a little clip from 1994 when I think it was Katie Couric was talking with, her co-host on the morning show or whatever show she's on, and literally said they were discussing the internet. And they were like, what is the at sign? And they were debating on the at sign of what actually you say to it. And then they were literally trying, it was like playful, but they were trying to describe what is the internet, that wasn't that long ago.
No.
And that was, before you even knew that you could Google what a ferret is. So, I mean, I one aspect of everything that's happening in the electric utility space is, we have this physical grid that has information, or however you want to call, like, the electron flow, moving in and taking action. And we've been able to manage it and control it to the system that is.
Yep.
And so I guess I can't reiterate enough that to do that, the majority of the utilities that are doing so didn't have to have that visibility. And so their IT systems and the evolution of how they've grown in the IT space was predominantly strengthened by the corporate needs that has grown in the industry. So your IT teams were really there as a service to a business, and the growth in the awareness and the workforce needed to stand up and develop and really drive all of your knowledge base that you've gained, but really, in your industry peers. It's like it's a transformation in itself. So that mindset of a utility is going from, oh, wait, there is so much happening in this IT space. Yes, we have IT, but it's a different function IT. So I guess, for this conversation, when you have an orchestration or an orchestra of stuff, you have a composer. And so those that own the assets that are regulated and required to perform safe, reliable, affordable delivery of those electrons need to really embrace this reality. And it's an uphill battle, as you probably have experienced in your world of Camus. So I guess I just wanted to throw it over to you. Like, what in your path of kind of onboarding, having discussions, and really engaging the utility space is, how can you, or what advice do you give to really putting the data that exists and really mapping out the action plan for them to embrace to improve this ultimate reality of grid orchestration that you've described?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think that point about needing a composer is a really key one, and that is really the role of the utility. The utility's responsibility is to maintain the physical infrastructure of the grid, but more than that, to provide reliable service to all customers based on that. And that's the reason why we work with utilities, because we were looking to provide, technology to help enable that. It's kind of funny too, because, I talk to investors and people on the tech side a lot, and they're like, hey, why do you want to work with utilities? Wouldn't you want to work with an easier customer? I'm like, well, utilities manage the grid, and the goal was to help with technology to manage the grid. So that's utilities. And so I think the point that you made as well about,
and I guess just like when we say that's utilities, it's a social structure we have created over the last 110 years. So there's like a decision factor is like, break down a whole system or transform and be synergistic with a system and then evolve into a new space. So.
Yeah, it's probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was starting to transition into this space, when I started the company, there was, I feel like, a little bit more conversation in the broader industry about like, oh, do we really need the grid? Maybe we're just going to move everybody to microgrids. Maybe all generation is local. And I think that's a very short-sighted view, personally.
But and it could, and that's another thing, it can be a reality, right? Like we can all end up being little microgrids. But there's a transition of many years, decades, or even if it's one day. It needs to exist.
Yeah, right? It could be, but the question that I would ask is, how do you provide universal service in that model?
Right, to all. Right.
Really, not just providing electricity, it's providing universal service and access to electricity to all. And that's why I think the role of the utility as the caretaker of that like universal connectivity layer is so critical in this transition, right? The question is not necessarily like how can we get all this new technology out there, like how do we get more rooftop solar or more microgrids or whatever. There's a place for all of these technologies. The question is how do we make this transition in a way that preserves that universality of access and the collective efficiency and economies of scale that you get from that universality of access. So
Right.
I really
So it's like an energy as a service, right? Like going back to our roots, like, so yeah, we kind of broken that business model. So I
yeah.
think the orchestration of the edge shows visibility or a North Star of what can be is the utilities return to that space where they're providing a service, in which that is to provide energy. How
Yeah.
that looks, really, we have to do it together. So.
And I think that's exactly right? It's really kind of how do you use the grid as the fundamental platform for this transition? And how do we do that in a way that isn't, unbelievably expensive and retains the reliability of service that everybody's come to expect? And so I think that's, you sort of asked earlier about the smart grid transition and the role of data and visibility in this. And it's certainly true that until very recently, retaining that reliability of service and that kind of, universal access principle didn't really require real-time data from, every meter or every substation or every transformer or whatever, because it was something that changed slowly. You could plan ahead for it, you could model it, you could predict it over a 10-year time scale. But once you're in an environment where the use cases for that platform are changing more quickly and it starts to perhaps show different behavior in a like kind of sub-yearly time scale, I think that's the place where really taking advantage of all of those investments that utilities have made for better instrumentation, better data becomes really kind of the killer capability. Like you really need to put that data to work and get more value out of it. This isn't really a question of like, oh, should we start over with instrumentation? This is a question of like, how do you get the value that we were supposed to get out of all of these new sources of data that we put in? And then what do you do moving forward from that?
And I think, a transition, right? Like also when we look at this space, there's just in the United States, there's approximately 30 or 3,300 utilities, distribution, that have distribution assets, maybe even more, community co-ops. But within that, they're all kind of in various mature states of unlocking. So I guess from your perspective, like what are the ground fundamental hardware and or software infrastructure that would be required to kind of ensure this reality as a building block perspective?
Yeah. So the state of technology maturity definitely varies across utilities quite a bit. We spent a lot of our first few years working in the co-op space where there's some that are very far along on their digitalization journey and many that are less far along, although I think that's changing pretty quickly. The foundational requirements from my perspective are a couple things. So firstly, you really need digital GIS maps. It's very difficult to map and kind of understand the data of the grid if it's on a piece of paper. There's very little that software can do to help you at that point. So digital GIS maps so that we can put the data around grid operations in context, I would say firstly is kind of a prerequisite. Fortunately, most have made that investment, although certainly not all. Having some form of access to data from key grid sources is also pretty important. And so that will typically be some form of access to SCADA system information. That also varies widely in maturity between utilities, but basically, some information about like current state of service, power flows, voltage, all of these things, substation, feeder head, whatever is available, like being able to get some of it in a computer, very helpful. And then smart meter data is also typically a key enabler, although there's a wide band of flexibility around that, even for the utilities that we work with today. Having smart meter data available for most meters providing, sort of hourly reads or better, ideally that you can source on an ongoing basis is best. It's hard to do a lot of even pseudo real-time operations if you can only get a monthly read. One of the early things that we did, though, was partner with Pacific Northwest National Lab on some work that was funded by the Solar Energy Technologies Office to figure out basically using modern big data, kind of machine learning and AI approaches, how much can you get out of the data that's out there? And so we did some work in that space on filling in gaps. Everything from, can you provide a kind of back forecast or synthetic curve given a monthly read? If you have some smart meter data, could you interpolate like what might be happening at those monthly read meters? The answer is you can, but the error bars are kind of wide, right?
Right.
And so they get narrower if you have SCADA available. But even for utilities that actually have smart meters, they're still pretty significant, right? Like even if you a normal smart meter deployment for a US utility is using an RF mesh communications infrastructure. And typically that means that even if they're getting reads every 15 minutes, there's still typically a 6 to 48 hour collection delay for bringing that data in. It is difficult to incorporate that into operations given that delay. It's also typically difficult given the volume of data involved and the capabilities of the systems that are deployed today to really put that information, sort of in the same place as like an ADMS system or SCADA data or, outage management systems will sometimes incorporate this data for outage detection, but that's typically sort of the state of the art for it. So there's a lot that we can do with those sources that are out there. It is definitely really helpful to have a modern-ish smart meter deployment, though, that does have those sort of 60 minute to 15 minute reads. If there's a collection delay, we can forecast into the gap. You can derive a lot of information from that, but smart meters are a useful prerequisite. And I say this with some hedging because there are those gaps too, but it's a good place to start.
Right. And I guess I wanted to, kind of peel back the onion because I think we as an industry do really great at talking about the high level vision, and that those that are actually tasked to do don't get the support or the awareness that others are struggling through the same journey. Because when you're within a utility wall, you are focused on your community, your customers, your assets, your brownfield systems.
Yes.
And you don't realize that that struggle is real across the whole industry. And so what I heard you say is like, there's a roadmap, right? So there's an evolution that every utility is on from a journey perspective. And it is fundamentally having awareness of your assets in the distribution grid, because the transmission grid has been really regulated and driven since the 80s when all the utilities decided to connect themselves together. And here we are. But the distribution grids are really islands in themselves owned by one particular utility. And that's very different than the transmission grid.
Yeah.
But all I have to say is we've seen another electrical grid, aka even though it's high voltage and there's a whole lot of other concerns and how you operate is different, take data and run near real-time power flow solutions.
Yes.
So the reality is that we know it exists. So from an evolution perspective, distribution companies should have their assets in a GIS database, so they're connected and how they're connected. That's important. 2, having field devices communicating back through SCADA. And so when you say that, that means like your breaker data, your intelligent pull-top switches, if you have them, if you don't, start deploying them, right? And really communicating. We have systems in place that make that near real-time power flow solution. So that next step is, yes, those smart meters. And I guess I just want to put a plug in the origination of smart meters, which I don't think the average public understands, is you had devices that were pretty much mechanical and you had to have someone read it and drive their car around to every meter on a regular basis, right? I mean, that's a lot of manpower. What a smart meter does is made it communicatable. But at the time, the only thing we were worried about was billing, which is our wattage. But now what we realize, and we have the infrastructure and the know-how and all of the expertise built over the last 15 years over AMI 1.0, is those meters can have data, which is your voltage, your VARs, your watts, and correlate other information. And that's like the crux of really bringing this orchestration reality to its forefront.
Yep.
And so that seems like a lot probably to someone sitting there without their DMS, which is your distribution management system. But from your perspective, like, you don't know what you don't know. So once you start working with utility, you can really start at any point in the guide of guiding them. And so, yes, there's some that are more mature, and you can jump right in and start deploying your orchestration. But then there's also the journey where bringing that reality to the front of their story, right? To say, we need to go do this stuff because this is where we're headed.
Yeah.
And I guess the next thing that comes up is us utilities and our data is very protected, right? There's all these privacy regulations and requirements that are put upon us as a utility defined by something 100 plus years ago. So how have you really worked through and the privacy and really cybersecurity concerns that now you have this edge data? Like, how's Camus see themselves in that space where there is a reality where this can be feasible, that you're sharing all this data and having this ability to manage and orchestrate it?
Yeah, definitely. So firstly, on the kind of privacy and security front, it's obviously something that we take really seriously. It's kind of table stakes for doing business in this space. We're really fortunate to have some folks on the team who have a pretty extensive cybersecurity background. And I actually worked on infrastructure support for privacy and security across Google as well. And so things like compliance with legal requirements for handling private data, which obviously also differ from country to country and state to state. Like California has a set of requirements, which is actually quite nearly at odds in some ways with like GDPR from the European context. And each state sort of has its own requirements as well. So there's a lot of nuance in handling this. But there is also good infrastructural support for handling this available within the computing industry. So firstly, we are
like, just to clarify, it's not like you all are inventing this reality. Like, it's something that has been going on and you're creating it within.
That's so. Firstly, we are deploying on top of cloud platforms that support a lot of the kind of fundamental building blocks for privacy and security protections for all critical industries, up to and including like military applications. And so we get a lot of boost from that because, the requirements are not necessarily less, but they're also not more than that. And we are really fortunate to have folks on the team with a deep privacy and particularly security background. So my CTO was part of Google's intrusion response team, and my head of engineering led up a bunch of the hardening work that Google did we were hacked by the Chinese government in about 2010 kind of time frame. And so there's a lot of lessons learned, like kind of in the tech industry around things like hardening against targeted intrusion, building architectures that are not just resistant to compromise, but also resilient to it. So there's a question of like, can intruders get in? But then there's also the question of what can they do once they get a secured credential? If they get in, do they have access to all the data? Or do they then have to kind of hack their way through every tiny other little piece in order to get access to any data or any sensitive information? And so we're able to take advantage of some of the sort of best practices developed on the tech side around building architectures that are resilient to compromise in those ways. And so using things like zero trust architectural principles, which require data to be encrypted in transit, which means like when it's moving through the network, and also at rest, which means when it's written to a hard drive, that's separately authenticated for every time you need to access it. Even if you just authenticated 2 seconds ago, the automated system that's going to access it for a different purpose still needs to present separate credentials, and those are separately protected. And so, a lot of this stuff was brought into the tech industry, out of some bitter experience. Which is not to say that, anybody can promise you to build systems that are completely resistant to hacking in all forms. But there are a lot of best practices that we can ride along with. And the cloud providers that we use also provide some of this stuff as a service. And so, obviously it's a really serious conversation that we have with the utilities that we work with. But I'm also part of, for example, a working group out of the DOE for using secured cloud platform deployments for the utility industry as a whole. And so I think like being part of that conversation with the utility industry is kind of part of helping utilities to take advantage of these things as well.
And I guess my line of questioning is coming from the awareness of, as we said, the grid itself and how we use energy is transforming. And some may say we've already transformed, to the idea that this is feasible. So the technology, the capabilities, the know-how, the expertise, just all of it is here at our fingertips, ready to grasp. And I think there's a significant amount of discussion outside the utilities looking in, asking, why are we not moving faster, right? Or how can we not respond? And I guess the building blocks is one, understanding where the utility was, right? Where they are today, where they're headed if certain things don't break free, and then where we ought to be, which is the conversation that I think everyone loves to have, but that meat of the how and the who. And so I guess once you have your GIS maps and you have your data that coming in and you have your smart meter deployment, there's still a lot of back end haul questions. And then comes, is it affordable? Do the customers want it? Why do they want it? And then there's also the compliance arm that doesn't fundamentally understand that there's a huge industry driving cybersecurity awareness, which you just shared a little bit, that kind of hinders discussions.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for those to understand is that like how utilities become agile and flexible and embrace the vendor space, such as Camus Power, is having all of these ducks in a row before starting. But the reality is we need to get a place where all of these moving parts kind of need to start happening before all the boxes are checked, right? So I guess the next one is, which is now becoming a buzzword and probably in your world, is the term artificial intelligence. So I like to say, we need to define very quickly. So we eliminate the destructive language that's going to be used to make it a scare tactic. But like when you hear the word artificial intelligence and machine learning, right, that's a big part of how you're able to enable this orchestration at the edge with your current software platform. What role does it play, and how can you put language around it to share that like that's where we're headed for the benefit of all?
Yeah, I think it's firstly sort of useful to differentiate because artificial intelligence is a pretty big sort of blanket term, and it can encompass everything from being able to, kind of ask ChatGPT to create, to write you a poem about the electric grid, to what I think of as the more boring use cases for artificial intelligence, which are all the things that are in kind of the machine learning space, particularly around interpretation of existing data sets and using that to build models and basically draw suppositions based on those models to help us answer questions. So the boring use cases are the ones that most people are using today. And I think these are ones that are really pretty well understood and not particularly scary. And this is things like forecasting, right? Like when people talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence, about 90% of the time, especially in the utility industry, what they mean is forecasting. We're building a model based on data that we have. We're using it to do better forecasting of particularly things like load and generation, but also perhaps things like long-term growth and stuff like that. And that's really just kind of running numbers, and it's a form of data science. We do a lot of that. And when we talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence in the context of like our technology set, that's really what we mean by it. Right. And so that's, forecasting is one use case there. Interpolation, which is filling in gaps in existing data, is also another one that falls under the it's definitely boring in the sense that it is not at all creating, a computer intelligence to operate the grid, but it is an application of artificial intelligence technologies that can really help for all of those utilities that have, what I think of as like real world data sources today. One of the biggest challenges in putting that to work is the ability to kind of manage that data at scale and to process it in ways that make it friendly to being able to do things like run model or run planning or whatever. And one of the things that's really hard about that is that all those data center sets have gaps in them. The gaps are different. Some of those gaps are inherent, like SCADA will typically, SCADA sources will typically collect data, perhaps as much as every second or even subsecondly. Meters collect data as often as 15 minutes, unless they're really smart meters. But then if you want to run a model that incorporates both meter data and SCADA data, you actually need the data to be from the same time step or it's not relevant.
I've experienced that.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that makes it really difficult to manage grid data at all is that you do need those time steps to match. One of the most kind of useful and simultaneously very boring applications of artificial intelligence is just aligning the timestamps and data and filling in gaps so that you can get to like, okay, here's my SCADA system information that I have. Here is meter data that used to be from like 2 seconds off that, but now we just filled in a gap. So we can say, okay, here's what it is right now.
Right.
So that kind of thing is really powerful enabling use case.
And I guess I'll just, from my journey getting into data analytics and data science through my dissertation work, it was like, I truly did not understand the terminology until I like read, a year's worth of lit research of like, wait, this is just really complicated math, and having the ability to like break up arrays and like assign values and then like a correlation of information.
Yep.
And I mean, to the 10th to the 100th degree, and you're really, data scientists don't like to do data cleansing. But fundamentally, that is like the stepping stone. So a lot of what the industry is talking about, and I think it's really important for stewards of like you and I to really get ahead of the messaging, because, somehow smart meterings got such a bad rap because they were going to be big brothers. But fundamentally, all it was saying is that you can communicate to it and use the data for the benefit of all. And we just didn't have the language, and I'm not sure we still have it, to convince probably half the folk. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence and data orchestration at the edge, like you're fundamentally just filling in the gaps, learning the behavior, forecasting how you're using energy. Because we as beings, when electricity first came to be, it was literally to light up the night, right? Like it was to drive industry to be able to work longer, which is kind of sad. And then also to like light up the yards and the stockyards that people aren't stealing, right? Like very fundamental, basic human behavior that we've now created this reality that we can't live without electricity for all the reasons we've developed. But in doing so, we were quite predictable for a century. We wake up, work, come home, go to bed. So from a forecasting perspective, we could do that with the data that we had, which is sparse and not very much. Now, though, with all of these devices that we can talk to for the benefit of ourselves, we can control our thermostat. We don't have to think about it. We can save energy. We can now plug in our cars. We can do it at a certain time. We can dim our lights to a level that makes our bill less. And that's a lot of thought. And that's really where all of those gadgets and gizmos are going in 5, 10, 15 years. Like we won't really understand why anyone in the world would have a light bulb that only came on at one level, right? I mean, so it's just fascinating. So I think to get ahead of it is the data quality, and then really there's just gap filling. Okay, enough of that. So I guess just from the journey that we're all on in grid mod, and I guess to kind of reiterate, we're going from a world that the infrastructure, the core infrastructure was the muscles of the physical hardware that created and then delivered the electrons. The new core infrastructure, and that's, I think, the essence of grid modernization, is embracing technology around software and the interconnection of really how it all talks together and how you integrate all of those data sources to take that information and deliver insights that we have yet to imagine because we don't know how the grid could ultimately work in this new microcosm that we're setting up. So it's an evolution. And so you got to deploy the sensoring, the measuring equipment, you have to bring back the data, and then you have to have a system that has the analytics and the capabilities to fill in the gaps, forecast the information, and then send messaging to the certain devices to take action. And that's what we're talking about when we're orchestrating. So I guess, what advice would you give, like call to action to those utilities that are hearing all of the buzz, that they can get started to really get to the point where they're orchestrating the edge of the grid effectively?
Yeah, so I think probably a couple of really big things. One is that utilities don't need to do this planning work in a vacuum. Every utility is in the process of sort of working through its roadmap for grid modernization, smart grid, DER engagement, these kinds of things. And those roadmaps do vary depending on the needs of the utility and the customers and the territory and all of those things, but they also have a lot of common elements. One of the nice things about working in the utility space is that utilities are typically willing to talk to each other and kind of share information. And so, firstly, I think just reminding folks that they don't have to think about this as happening in a vacuum, and that their neighbors probably, maybe have roadmaps they can crib from, and nobody has the complete picture yet, I think, of what the grid is going to be. but
Right.
many utilities have, a lot of experience with different parts of that transition. I think the other thing that is also useful to think about as we think about learning from others is that some geographic areas are, further ahead in some ways. And it's easy to think like, oh, what's happening in Hawaii or what's happening in California doesn't necessarily apply to my grid. It may not in the aggregate, but the specific things that you can learn about the technology implications are really helpful. I'm from Australia. There's a lot of really interesting work happening in Australia for the reason that Australia has about 40% of homes with rooftop solar at this point, which is a lot of rooftop solar.
Right.
And so this is also not just a process that's being driven internally by the utilities either. This is also something that's happening externally on the grid that's really kind of driving that need. So I think looking to neighbors, but also, casting a little bit further afield to international neighbors is helpful too. Secondly, really just asking more of that data and those data sources that have been already deployed, I think is a really good place to start, right? Like most utilities have made some investments. Many have point solutions where they're putting more of that data to work. Like maybe they have smart meter deployments and they've started to, use that for transformer loading analysis and things like that. I think that those are a really good step in the right direction, but really like making that data work a little bit harder for its keep is a really good next step too. Like really starting to think about like what insights do we need to solve business problems that we have? Where is
And
that?
don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah. And so
Even
I
if
also think that like tying it together to the business problems is really critical too, because nobody's really excited to spend a lot of money on just cleaning up data or getting more data. But if it's, tied to questions like, how do I speed up interconnection requests? Or how do I support these really big new loads coming online in places where I can't necessarily afford to build more grid to support them? Then the cost of incorporating that data and working with it is not necessarily as significant in the context of that really big business problem as it might be if it was just like an expense. So I think that's probably the other piece too.
And I guess I'll just, maybe this is for perspective, and I was just at an energy conference yesterday, and there's so much language being used towards the utility to go faster, be better, show up differently. And so I think, you talk a lot about no one wants to spend money on cleaning up data. So from a utility perspective, we have to look at what the regulatory model that allows or disallows us to be risk seeking. I mean, we don't want to risk, but like risk in regards to how we spend the money. But we also need to be innovative and entrepreneurial because this space is moving so rapidly, and we can't have all of the use cases developed and all the cost benefit analysis defined and quantified if we're not doing anything. So you learn by doing. And so we're in a regulatory model, which I think is, even though there's 50 regulated entities and then the federal over top, there's like a common theme is, because of the financial model where we're deterred or not incentivized to spend on setting up this data infrastructure, IT fleet of integration, it's seen as O&M. And so that's not how the utility space fundamentally makes money from a capital investment. Now, not every utilities entity is fully, the financial model is the same, but that big driver of capital making what it does and O&M doing what it does really deters and really locks you in because you have to advocate to your customers. And when there's an affordability proponent, or maybe it will cost more proponent, you kind of get shuttered. So I think, that's just really for any of the listeners to think is like to be able to invest in this agility, flexibility, and embrace all of these future customer programs to serve electricity to all. We need to really move a little faster. And to do that, we need to be able to spend the money in the right ways and be incentivized to do so. So
one thing that I would just say to that is like, I think that part of that resistance to change in some sense is part of being an operator of critical infrastructure. And that is fine, right? Like that is appropriate. You want to be really careful with the technologies that you deploy that affect the reliability of a critical service. I ran ops teams in a different context, and the initial stance for any operations team is basically like, well, if it's working today, I'm going to be really careful about what I'm going to change. And so, I think that's understandable and that's fine. Your point about the difficulties, though, of aligning the regulatory structure with, the perspective of operators, I do think makes it harder than it needs to be to make
Yes.
changes in this industry.
And I think we're getting past like the operators, like this is how we've done it. It always worked this way, and this is how we're right.
Mhm.
It's now, I think, all of the use cases and the awareness that data can provide
Yeah.
safer, more efficient, and reliable operation is now like at the forefront.
Yep. Yeah. And so I think like one thing that I would sort of leave as a parting thought on the regulatory front is that a lot of these conversations get easier when you can have them on a 2 or 3 or 5 year time horizon instead of a 1 year time horizon. Depending on the state, some regulators require a very short time horizon for justifying investments. But
Right.
if you look at it maybe a year or two out, the money that you might invest now could really reduce costs in a couple years. And so like just being a little bit more flexible about like really thinking about the future of the system on the regulatory side, I think would be very helpful.
Right. I think, again, the whole grid mod pod is to really educate and engage an industry that doesn't know so that we can all synergistically work towards solutions to really unlock the power of data. So I love it. Well, thank you so much, Astrid, for joining. And I look forward to continue to see the journey and working with, vendors and data entities like you all to kind of unlock this future. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.